Welcome back, everyone, to Random's Thoughts. Coming to you now with another Runestrike Diamond deck breakdown. And this one was kind of interesting because it wasn't actually sequentially the most recent deck that I made Diamond with, but I wanted to take some time to talk about it because we had a break due to the enormous champion rebalance patch and, of course, the new seasons patch that influenced a number of the things that I was playing, and this was the one that I spent the most time with post-patch, so I wanted to talk about it. What deck is that? Well, I think to get you in the right frame of mind, I want to quote one of the seminal philosophers of a generation in saying, "I like big butts, and I cannot lie." As you may have guessed by the joke, this is an Emrys build, and we're building into the idea that Emrys is one with the wilds, we'll say. He very much tries to play and buff various minions and then just push them outside of removal range. But there are some caveats, and as you can see up there, where it says bad Emrys is bad, I'm not really contented with this list, although it did manage to push us all the way to Diamond. So we're going to jump in and first, as always, talk about the champion powers. So if you'll notice, because of the patch, and thank you, developers, shout out to the team producing Runestrike, because I was very excited personally about this, that now it's a much lower level requirement in order to unlock all of the associated powers with the champion. If you're interested in my thoughts on why, you can check out many of the other videos I have on YouTube or one of the live streams. We won't put it in here. But we do now have access to all three abilities, and the last one for Emrys has come up a fair amount and changed the scope of games. Can you win without it? Yes, but it does make a significant difference. So we'll start off with A1. A1 is Sage Staff, target a friendly minion, restore health equal to its health. Well, as we alluded to earlier, things are going to have big butts. They're going to have big back ends. The second number that ends up on the right, down here in the corner. When you hear the card game slang big butts, that's what we're talking about. In this case, you can obviously present the option to your opponent that you're going to gain a ton of life over the course of the game. Now, the blood cost is not insignificant. You're not really going to be spamming this unless you're including blood generators, and that's not impossible given that this particular realm combination does have access to a number of them. But realistically, you want to judiciously use this to say, hey, this is a mostly even race. I'm going to break it wide open. Or, hey, I'm about to die. I'm going to do this. Now, there are other ways to break the race, as you'll see when we get to A3, but this gives you a lower blood cost option. And of course, sometimes healing is what you need, and this offers it. Next up is Life Force. Now, while you can live without A3, you can't really run this deck without Life Force, at least in my opinion. You can run it. It's gonna probably go uncomfortably, we'll say. Life Force is target friendly minion gains 2 health. All other friendly minions gain 1 health. Now, this used to be 2 and then 2 across the board, but it was recently changed in the previously mentioned major champion rebalance alongside the new season release. But this is still pretty good. Does it change games? Of course. There are times where your entire board would have previously survived Desert Twister or other damage-based board clear that now only a single minion will. That's going to happen, and to be perfectly honest, it's fair. There are many times where, just like many aggro decks or control or combo or any archetype, you're going to have these oops, I win hands where your opponent just goes, well, I guess I can't deal with a 17-19 Raptor. Those numbers probably don't make much sense, but you have this enormous health stat, and then you have an enormous attack value, at least on Raptor. But even if you have a low attack value, which we'll get to when we talk about the individual cards, the big back end means that you can actually dictate combat much more readily. It means that you can try and preemptively survive board clears. You can actually block things, which sounds like a foreign concept in the game of Runestrike, because the way the combat works, and anybody who's played it is familiar, you don't take retaliation damage. So the attacker has an enormous advantage by having a threat out there, your opponent really needs to not only have a bigger health pool than your attack, but also have probably twice as much or more in order to ensure that they're not just going to croak to a given board clear plus the attack, or a damage spell, or insert other thing, or buff spell, whatever. Point is that it's very difficult to block effectively in Runestrike. Emrys gives you that option because if you peek and cheat over at the list up there, you can see a lot of these things have more health than you might ordinarily have, and they're going to have even more because of life force and other effects. At 2 blood cost, you're generally spamming it for a few turns. You're not going to use your blood early on in the game. You'll probably wait until turn 4 so that you can activate it again on the follow-up turns. It also allows you to play it through those mid-game turns to then start banking after that to then either heal or to close the game out with A3, which we'll get to momentarily. That's the general play pattern. Obviously, it will vary depending on the matchup. Now, the last but not least is Spirit Unleashed, and this is, as you'd imagine, your finisher. If we once again cheat and look at the minions up there, they aren't really all that impressive on the front end. Yes, Raptor can get to Jurassic Park level proportions, which, as a side note, this deck almost got called because of how important Raptor is. We'll get to that later. But most of them, you're just kind of chipping away. You're poking here, you're poking there, you're constantly applying small amounts of pressure, and realistically, these minions kind of just supplement Emrys as the primary damage dealer. Again, outside of Raptor. You can, of course, buff them. There are other ways outside of this deck, and we'll talk about that later as well. But it's very simple to just go, oh, I've been buffing up this minion all game with life force. They suddenly have 12 health because your opponent didn't want to stand in front, or they just accepted that, oh yeah, that particular minion is just never gonna die. Well, bang. Spirit Unleashed, tag you for 20 plus in a single turn between just a single minion because, hey, we got one of the 10/10 Earthen off of one of the Conjure cards or something along those lines. It's a very important closer, especially as you get to the higher ranks, because you have to be very cognizant of overfilling your lanes and then, oops, I have a 2/15 Island Turtle. My opponent just played March of the Undead, or Rise of the Undead, excuse me. I guess I lose because my board is filled up with mostly garbage and they have either evasion, bigger minions, whatever. You can run into weird scenarios. It's also notably outside of combat, so it dodges guard, protect, insert other effects that would impede your ability to close the game out just by simply punching your opponent. So the self-internal synergy of Emrys's powers is really cool. You are kind of blood hungry. Again, every time I say stuff like that, it feels weird to say, but this deck, you very much have to plan out exactly how you want to utilize your blood resources. And if you don't include generators, you're going to need to map it out ahead of time and really get a feel for it. If you're just starting out with the deck, that's fine. Spam A2, you'll figure it out as you go along. But let's jump into the cards themselves. Now, before I get into the actual cards, let's take note and take a moment to appreciate that the Blitz package actually isn't in here. Now, it could easily be in here. I don't really see a problem with including Sickle Stalker or Mastodon or insert other minion because they're good. Do they synergize well with Emrys's powers? Not really, but the goal is not necessarily to create the most synergistic deck. The goal is to create a build that wins. This one wins. You could certainly improve it, and we're going to talk about that as we go through. In this particular case, the only Blitz minion that we're featuring is Iron Bowl, and I know I'm going out of sequence, but we're getting it out of the way at the front. Why are we including Iron Bowl? Well, I wanted some Blitz. Overall, that is one of the weaknesses of the deck, is that you don't have fantastic ways to remove things outside of combat. Often you have to jump through some hoops. While things such as Feast or Famine could hypothetically remove something immediately, It's same story as Iron Bull. There's a limitation on what you can or can't do in one turn, which is the important part. You could also jump through hoops to set up Cling to Life and Bright Song or Desert Twister, and we'll talk about those individually. But the general idea when it comes to Blitz and the removal is this deck isn't great at saying, hey, that guy's a pain. He needs to go away. Get him out of here. You have to jump through some hoops and often 2-for-1 yourself in order to remove a significant threat. Iron Bull allows you to both apply pressure. It's a relevant threat, especially if you can buff its health. It could easily be something else, but I kind of just threw it in there. I think that there's definitely value in looking at the Blitz package in general, but this is kind of a tight deck list if you want to include all the fun stuff. I know that kind of battles with my earlier statement about creating a deck that wins the most, but there is a balance to be had between the two. So let's actually go back to the top and talk about the removal. We'll bounce around for this one a little bit. So the removal here, Cling to Life is a key component. Remember how I said earlier that a lot of your minions have very low attack? Realistically, they do. And Cling to Life essentially allows it to be true removal. When I say true removal, just get rid of that guy. Obviously, things like Resurrect accepting. And of course, you have to expend your combat step, which is a notable resource in this deck since you don't apply an enormous clock, barring a Raptor. However, Cling to Life does synergize well, late in the game at least, with Twister and Bright Song. Synergize isn't the right word, it's more combined, but then people think combo, and that's not really what we're talking about. In this particular case, it allows you to either at 8 mana or at 9 mana respectively, just say, okay, that guy goes plus the rest of your board, takes a bunch of damage, or something happens. Desert Twister, basically. Or you could, of course, combine it with Iron Bull on turn 7. There are a variety of different ways. Turn 6 with Feast or Famine. It's one of the few effective ways for you to, for a low cost, remove things. This is just one of those faction combinations, one of the realm combinations that's how it is. I doubt, given the flavor and the way things seem to be pointed for the game, and it's still very early on, so this could change, that we're going to get much else outside of this, either in general or outside of this particular theme. So for now, Cling to Life, I feel, is very important for the build. Speaking of the other removal, we mentioned Feast or Famine a number of times. It serves a dual purpose. Don't do like me and keep forgetting that there are dual modes to this. It's not really that I forget. I just constantly auto-click Famine and then accidentally famine my own units. Believe me, that doesn't feel great. Sometimes it's okay, but it doesn't feel great. So you could instead make the correct play and famine your opponent's guys. Anything up to 5 health, including things that are protected, gone. Get out of there. Feast also synergizes well because, especially in light of A3, you could say, oh, I have a thing with an enormous backside. All right, well, I'll feast it and then A3. Tag you for a gazillion. Or, oops, you're dead. Sort of thing. Alternatively, of course, you can make things survive combat, etc. It's a bunch of tricks. It's pretty efficient. The modality definitely helps it out. Now, of course, we're going to include the 2 board clears in Twister and Bright Song. I have a hard time justifying not including them in any deck that happens to feature their respective realms. This one's no exception. You also, again, don't have great removal options. You don't have, just nuke that thing and combust or annihilate. You don't have the apocalypse or sets of the world, so you have to work with what you have. Unfortunately, because of the limitations, you often have to combine them, like we were saying earlier with Cling to Life, so you can get very clunky turns, or you have to very much manage your life total by utilizing A1 or blocking in weird ways in order to ensure that you can survive long enough to say, hey, I need a Bright Song this turn, but next turn I'll do something. Or I need a Desert Twister this turn and then follow it up next turn. Or I need to survive 2 more turns with that thing on the board in order to be able to Cling to Life plus other effect. It can be very challenging, but you definitely have the tools to compete with these various decks through the removal options. It's an area of the deck that I think could definitely be improved. So let's talk about the actual minions now. First up is Owl Familiar, and previously I had included Swamp Scout, and I actually felt that my hand was getting clogged a lot. Since removing the Swamp Scout, now I kind of feel like I'm running out of cards. It's this weird middle ground, so maybe one Swamp Scout has to come back in. I'm not really sure. We'll have to play it by ear, but for now, the Owl Familiar is pretty important. You need to find the cards that you need constantly. This is not a deck that really can draw a lot of cards. I mean, yes, you have some conjure effects aside from the Owl. Your minions could hypothetically, or your board clears hypothetically generate X for ones, but you can't afford to durdle around, and you often need to continue presenting threats. And the risk there is that despite having big backends, sometimes your opponent can just clear your board, and you need to be able to rebuild quickly. Or if your opponent kills your buffed up, super tall minion, another CCG slang or term that if you're going tall, you're buffing a single thing real big, as opposed to going wide and filling all the lanes, presumably with smaller minions. If you're going tall by playing Gigantify or a number of life forces onto, say, a Raptor, your opponent removes it, that's a lot of cards invested, especially if it's an X for one. So you really need Owl Familiar or other things to help refuel, gas back up, and continue applying pressure. And I'm going to harp on that over and over again because your minions kind of suck in this build, at least on the attacking front. So you need to make sure that you're getting value out of them when you can. And that includes tempo. So next up is Petrified Egg. I'm not real sure about this one. Now, Petrified Egg is kind of okay. I'm going to take a moment and pull this up because I believe we can see the crocodile now. Perfect. So since we can see the crocodile, you can see that it's a 2/3 with blitz, lethal, and rally. It gains 2 attack and loses 1 health. Now, previously, with Life Force, where it would give 2 across the board, you didn't have to target this, and it would always be profiting health, essentially. Ignoring other effects, of course. We're just talking about the crocodile's ability. The problem here is now you're just stabilizing. Again, completely understand why it was changed, but it's something to keep in mind where you're actually targeting your A2. There are some occasional one-attack minions that see play. You know, you might see a Naval Explorer or something that you could plop this in front of, but realistically, it's got to be played off lane. It's very difficult to play it in a lane and then actually have it fight the thing in front. You can only A2 once a turn, so even then it only has 4 health, and most likely your opponent can deal with 4 health at virtually any point in the game, especially if it's played in front of a minion. Is this card good? It's okay. I could definitely see it be on the chopping block. It's just kind of cute. I personally like it because I love playing undead cards, as I said in my preview for Cryptic Bones. The card is fun. It can definitely grow, and that's something worth pointing out, is that similar to Raptor, and I guess Feral Beast to some extent, it's a growing threat. Your opponent must address it, and therefore they have to invest cards in it at some point. Unfortunately, they probably won't have to spend that many to address it. That's the problem. But if you can get it to large proportions, more power to you, and it's not significantly different than any other large minion that you invest your resources in. Now, it does have lethal, so it will eat bigger things. Occasionally, you'll catch people, but you can't really rely on your opponent making a mistake. Bottom line is, where the previous 2 cards I think are pretty important, I don't find the egg as important, and I think you could look to replace it. Speaking of things to replace, Carnivorous Plant. I hate this card. There's a way you can get cute by giving it guard and all that kind of fun stuff. And then maybe slap a regrowth on it. I'll admit I've lost to that before, where sometimes my opponent just got it loaded up. It had like 17 health. It had guard and it was healing up every turn. You got me. But again, that's a number of different cards sunk into something that's not actually killing your opponent. In this particular build, it does not. We don't feature the light card that grants it guard, so therefore it's removal, really bad removal, because odds are, yeah, it'll kill an early game minion, but it drops off very quickly. It just kind of got slotted in towards the end of my push to Diamond because there were other things that I didn't like. And it was just, okay, well, I'll give it a shot. I've seen it in other Emrys builds. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think this needs to go, unless you're really leaning into it, and I'm not sure that's something you really want to do. Granted, if aggro becomes a much bigger priority and they're not featuring Combust, yes, loading this thing all up with, you know, buffing it every turn, plus playing the guard, plus playing regrowth, could be a soft lock against aggro, maybe even a hard lock, so keep that in mind. Next up is a card that I actually do want to include more copies of, but I'm not sure. And I'll explain what I mean. Druid Ruins is one of the new cards, and I was very excited when it was revealed, I believe, by Satisfied Beard. And this card buffs your follow-up nature plays. The problem is, you don't actually have that many. Yes, if you have an awkward curve and you end up with Owl Familiars or eggs later on, sure. Otherwise, we're talking about Island Turtles and Feral Beasts, which would be under drops on the turn they get played. I think that the list needs to evolve in order to further accommodate Druid Ruins. Now, it's going to get changes as I acquire more cards, but it's something to keep in mind that if you're going to run this, you really want to play it on 3 and then play a 4-drop nature card to immediately curve into, so that you're presenting a threat that is now statted above the curve, and you were probably playing it already because it was good enough, such as Island Turtle. Now the Island Turtle, for example, is a 3/8. That's both sizable and it conjured a card for you, which is likely nature, which is then going to get buffed. Like, it all adds up. Plus, it already starts with a sizable amount of health, so it's less likely to die. You could buff it up with other things if your opponent chooses to ignore it. Pro gamer tip: don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. But there are a number of positives for it. The reason why I'm not sure is because, again, in this particular build, we're not featuring a ton of nature things. We also are taking turn 3 off, and if your opponent does remove it immediately or simply plays a blitz minion, like a Sickle Stalker is good enough, unless you have follow-up removals such as Feast or Famine, because realistically, Cling is not going to do it, and then Twister and Brightsong are going to take too long, and you can't blitz into it, so you have to have out-of-hand removal to protect it. Or, I guess you could buff it, and then that doesn't really make much sense to do, but, you know, it is an option. Point is that it could be difficult to protect. You don't want to go overboard. You have to definitely recognize that you've gotten your value out of it, or cut your losses if it's not going to work. And that's the problem with these sort of cards that are just support things. But it's something to keep an eye on, even if it doesn't make the cut in current Emrys builds. That as time goes on, we're obviously going to get more nature minions. Presumably some of them will be at 4 cost, which is really where you want to make sure you get value. At 1 activation, you're probably about even. At 2, I think you're profiting. Anything beyond that should never happen. Like, your opponent should never allow you to do that. But if they do, fantastic. You're off and running. But I really like Druid Ruins. I want to play with it more, and that's why I want to include a second copy, probably in place of the awful Carnivorous Plant right now, and then we'll play it by ear from there. Now, next up is Feral Beast. Feral Beast was, again, another late edition. I saw it in other Emrys builds. I'm not a huge fan. It is a growing threat, and making it a 3/5 the turn you play it, it would be a little bit early to start expending blood, but it's not the end of the world. It's okay. You could definitely utilize it. It can definitely grow. And if you're targeting with Life Force, you have a few turns before opposing Light Songs and Righteous Rats end up 1-for-1ing it. Now, why do I call that out? Well, guess what? It happened in some recent games. But it's really not great. You know, it's a 3-drop. You're not very excited. You don't have a ton of ways to grant trample in this deck, which we'll get to after we finish the minions out. But without trample, your opponent can just chump block this, which is not necessarily in their favor. They're losing cards, but it does buy them time, and again, you don't have a great clock. This can present a at least respectable clock once it strikes twice, but then that means if your opponent blocked it twice, you get him once. Like, is that worth it? It's not fantastic. It's definitely something I want to look to replace, but the main reason it was included is because I wanted more 3-drops. There was kind of a dearth of them once I initially looked at the build, and therefore, due to the lack of them, I wanted to include some. These, it's kind of sad to say they were the best ones to fit the build, but there they are. Next up is something that I'm more enthusiastic about, and that's Island Turtle. The main reason is the Conjure. It allows you to get all of that other cool stuff that you want to find, and reduces its cost. You're fine with virtually any earthen other than, I guess, more carnivorous plants, and then diabolical whatever, the other terrible plant. They're pretty solid. I really like Island Turtles, and chaining Island Turtle off of Island Turtle is also not bad. They have big butts. If you can buff them with things on the attack end, namely Gigantify or some other effect, if you conjure something that allows you to buff them or get it off, play it after a Druid of Ruins, fantastic. Otherwise, they can block a significant number of things and allow you to set up a racing scenario where your Raptor's off in one corner, your opponent can't effectively deal with it, and then you're blocking on the other side or in the other lanes with Island Turtle, and it's chunky enough that it's difficult to get through. Now, speaking of Raptor, I mentioned earlier that this deck is, or was, potentially going to be called Jurassic Park because this is the centerpiece. This is arguably the most important card in the deck. It kind of takes over the game if your opponent doesn't remove it immediately. And the fact that you can go to 6 health the turn you play it and then 8 the follow-up turn, assuming that, you know, your opponent doesn't do anything, is huge. It will dodge virtually every damage-based board clear at curve, unless, you know, your opponent has the nuts and somehow manages either to ramp up the damage on something, or they hit an insane arcane overload, or they they decimate, or whatever the order one that's based on your champion's attack. Suddenly you have like a billion attack and you're able to get there. Really, you're dodging almost all damage-based removal, and you only fear things like Combust. You're going to punch through virtually every blocker, and you're going to ensure, because you're going to want to protect it, anything that tries to interfere with the Raptor gets negated by healing. You're basically spamming Life Force on this if it hits play, and it's not an unreasonable target for Feast, because you're going to end up pushing so much damage. It's not, I don't want to say uncommon, because it's kind of rare, but I've won a number of games where I had a double-digit Raptor, double-digit attack Raptor, and it's just like, all right, I don't know what you're going to do about this, but if that even connects once, I could do nothing for the rest of the game and just punch you to death with my champion. Like, that's an enormous amount of damage, not counting all the damage before that. It gets up there very quickly. Of course, you have to fear single target removal. There's not much you can do about that. It unfortunately, oddly enough, if it cost 5, it would dodge Combust as well as Annihilate, but Combust is still a viable option to remove it. This is kind of the centerpiece of the deck right now. Could it be changed? Maybe, but it's hard to see a reason to do that. Unfortunately, it is neutral, so you won't get a buff off Druid Ruins. Can't have everything. Now, we already talked about Iron Beast. The last minion in the deck is Angel of Hope, and I like this thing. It's just awkward to play because the 9 costs you. It's not nature, so if you get the Earthen that reduces the cost of all your nature cards by 2, it doesn't affect this. You don't have 1-drop, so you're taking your entire turn regardless of what turn it is. It's just very clunky to play, and that could be said about a lot of things in this deck, where you're just waiting for awkward turns or forcing awkward turns because you don't really have any other option. But Angel of Hope definitely does serve important purposes by allowing you to heal without having to spend blood. It has big enough back end that you are able to either A1 or A3 for a decent amount. And on top of all that, the flight here is actually pretty good, both to address and block other opposing flyers, but also so that you can push damage, and this is one of the most sizable attackers in the deck, especially pre-Raptor buffs. It's the biggest attacker in the deck. So you have to find a time to play Angel of Hope, because most of the time you need to, for either being a threat or for the heals, or sometimes both. But Angel of Hope has put in a lot of work for me. So that covers the minions. It covers the removal. That only leaves Gigantify. Now, Gigantify is very important for this deck. I would say it's crucial. Why is that? Well, again, your guys have low attack. It's an attack buff. Cool. You have things that could get bigger, but can't trample. Enter Gigantify. That's probably the bigger piece. While, of course, Gigantifying a Raptor is a big deal because it has speed, it's also very relevant to give it trample so that your opponent can't just chump block it, and you can actually push damage. And that goes for any of your minions, whether they're from the deck or whether they're conjured. Often you can play 5, 6, 7, 10 attack minions But if they don't have trample, your opponent's chump blocking them, and your earlier clock was likely garbage. Now, admittedly, a number of the late game earth-ins, such as Awakened Earth, or whatever the 10 cost one that reduces everything, that's a 10/10 is called. We'll get to that in the other section. But they have trample innately, but there are other options that don't. And sometimes you just need to slam it on a feral beast to push damage now. You got to be applying pressure. So now that we talked about all the individual cards, let's talk about the deck as a whole before we get into possible changes. Taken as a whole, Emrys does exactly what you kind of expect him to do. He makes big, beefy minions. Well, they do their squats, they do their lunges. They may not necessarily be working very much chest and shoulders or whatever muscle group you happen to consider would be the offensive end. They certainly have the support from the back to prove it. But the problem is you do sometimes have issues closing games out, and it actually starts in the early game. And the reason for that is you need to make sure that you're getting in here, getting in there, so that at the end of the game, it actually adds up. In fact, in a number of games that I had in the final push to Diamond, things went to exhaustion. My opponents ran out of cards, and the void damage accounted for a significant chunk of damage. We're talking like 4 or 5 turns in void damage. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have closed the game out, which is concerning, which is part of the reason why there need to be a number of changes for this particular list, but we'll leave that for the next section. In general, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you are really careful about your blood abilities. You need to expend them properly. Don't just frivolously burn things for life force for the sake of life force. You also need to make sure that you're setting up favorable trades or pushing damage. Now, I know I talked about that before, but your minion placement is very important because you need to account for what are the likely removal cards that they're going to play. Are they damage based? Is it just single target removal? Is it going to be a combination of blitz minion plus other thing? How many have they played so far? You need to take all this into account each time you place a minion. Now, things like Raptor, yeah, you're dumping it in an open lane 99.9% of the time. But Island Turtle may end up blocking, and even if it gets run over, that doesn't necessarily matter. There were a number of games, and I envision a lot more, where it's simply going to be a racing scenario, and you need your whatever minion to sit in front, soak a couple of attacks, and let your Raptor run out of control. Is that always going to work? No. Partially because, going back to the earlier point, your removal options aren't great. You need to be very conscious of where you're expending them. So overall, Emrys requires a lot more consideration than probably a lot of other builds, just because you are somewhat limited. You may do something that is sometimes very unfair by setting up a very early and powerful Raptor, but you could just as easily be floundering and being forced to play feral beasts in front of your opponent's minions and desperately trying to claw back into the game. And that's where you need to be conscious of utilizing A3 or other effects that just kind of barely scrape and claw your way across the finish line before your opponent does. But since we alluded to it so many times, let's talk about some of the changes that could be made to this particular Emrys list. Normally, I would break all of this up card by card, and maybe we'll do that with some of the later ones, but as you can see on screen, I just searched for Earth. And why? Well, Island Turtle is one of the major pieces, but secondly, these are a lot of your options to play, and the reason for that is a lot of them do solve many of the issues that we were talking about, namely having threats and already being big enough to, well, present a threat to your opponent. Whether you play them so that you can immediately heal, or you play them so that you can actually end the game via A3 or punching, it doesn't matter. But all of the earthen end up playing well together. They synergize very well. It is not uncommon for me to pull Herald of Stone or Awakened Earth from any given Island Turtle and be very happy about it. They definitely allow me to have a top end. Now, there's an argument, therefore, to never include them, because you'd always pull them off Island Turtle, but having that consistency is important. Notably, they are also nature, which means that they play well with the aforementioned Druid Ruins. Each of these have options except for maybe the cheap 3. Again, I don't like Carnivorous Plant. Diabolical Blossom is mostly terrible. Petrified Egg is the very definition of mediocre right now. All of the others, however, whether it's Legacy Tree, the Oaken Fist Lantern, Tree and Goliath, Herald of Stone, or Awakened Earth, could all be utilized. If we look at the neutral options, they lose the nature tag, so no Druid Ruins. They also lose a lot of power. I'm not super excited about these. If you conjure them, great. There are scenarios where it might matter, but for the most part, they're overcosted for what you want to do. You're going to want to look at the ones with the green border more than the other options. Another consideration, since we talked about having a lack of removal or effective removal, is Fleshed Soil. Now, you could just dodge the Legacy Tree that ends up there. And unless your opponent's more lich or has some way to sacrifice their own units via consume or other effects, they're going to be stuck with this tree clogging up one of their lanes. It's actually not a bad option. I've definitely considered it. At 5, it's just very clunky. You should have a good matchup against aggro opponents because generally your minions are big enough to both block and then eat their guy unless they expend extra effort. Flesh of Soil will be a little slow for that, but really it answers the things that you would need to out of slower control decks. Another card that I don't have, but I've seen used great effect out of Emrys builds, is Great Elk. And realistically, this thing is a pretty big threat. It obviously presents the same issue where very low on the front end, but very big on the back end. Difference here is its rally allows you to create virtually immortal minions. And it's very difficult outside of Ramses or Faith for your opponent to end the game, and I guess some combo decks, to end the game outside of combat. So if you're able to lock down the board, especially if you have 2 elks healing each other, you could soft lock or even hard lock your opponent very early on, or relatively early on. So Great Elk is definitely a consideration, whether it's in this version of Emrys or just about any other. We're back to selecting, or multi-selecting, a number of different cards. This time we're looking at Conjure, and I honestly feel that they're all viable options here. As mentioned, the deck is still working out exactly how many card draw cards it wants, or Conjure cards for that matter. And each of them in this particular build would work out. Any of the Conjure Beasts, obviously the Conjure Earthen works. Merge with Nature could certainly work. I'm not as excited about Glimmerwing Codal or necessarily the neutral options, although Celestial Palace could offer a number of interesting options. I think you have the ability to generate a lot of powerful cards out of this that will synergize well with the deck in its existing game plan. I don't want to make this video 7 years long and call out every single big minion that's in the game, but I do want to call particular attention to Nemean Lion. Again, another card I don't have, but I don't think you need to have too powerful of an imagination to foresee how strong it would be in this particular deck. It allows you to lock down the board for a turn, it's a huge threat, it's very difficult to deal with, and you can continue to preserve it by buffing its health, or just simply tag your opponent for 7, or heal for 7, whatever happens to be the most appropriate. It's something that I think will ultimately find a home in the deck. So that kind of does it for the deck. Of course, there are other options. Of course, there are other ways to build it. But that's how I've had success with Emrys, at least up to this stage. I'm going to keep messing around with this deck, both on and off stream, because it is fun sometimes to just go full Timmy and play big monsters. So if that's your thing, I would definitely recommend the deck up there or some variation of it. So let me know down in the comments whether you feel I missed something, if there are other things that you want to see, or maybe even what the next champion I should try and run to Diamond with. That'll do it for this time, though, so as always, everybody, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and Black Lives Matter.